Mm. You just said the KKK thing, and
Um, okay, so my thought for today, and we're a small crowd, but that's okay. Uh, Take a piece of paper. You can take more than one piece of paper. I don't know, just whatever you want. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but in terms of, I always find my process through has been sort of, I said, is self-preservation, some sense of like I'm trying to get to the base of it, because we have lots of examples that we can tease it out. So if you trace it like a root tree or a sin tree back, well, is this type of sin, it falls into this category, which comes from this type of weakness that comes from, and maybe they all boil down to pride or something to some extent. But that's the question for me is I don't think all sins are based in pride. I don't think someone is lustful or glutton necessarily because of pride. I think pride can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. So what I did is I wrote sin in, and I kind of went back through my notes and just was thinking about like how would I categorize the larger sin and what sin was in that era in just a few words. So what I'd like to do in this, just as a sense of review, it's been in 9 weeks that we've been doing this. I never thought I would teach a series on sin that would last this long. But I mean, and honestly, it's been interesting to me to see it uncover. But what I kind of want to give to you is I'm going to give you a couple words. I'll say a few things. And what I would say is, as I'm writing this, as you're thinking, and as you're hearing this, as you're thinking about this, the hope would be that you'd be like, okay, what are the things that I'm resonating with in that period? And we can ask questions of why about that, but what is resonating with me in that period, or why is that there? Because do I think that sin, that we can define sin? No, I don't think we can necessarily like exactly what sin is to God. I think we're just taking stabs at it. Actually, the passage I preached on Sunday is about the foolishness of humanity's wisdom. So our understanding of sin is going to be fallen or problematic, and I'm sure that self-preservation, and I'm going down again at lowest space level. But so I want to kind of go through these. I have a few points of just in terms of the larger picture that sort of come out, like where sin differs and how when it changes and where it shifts, that I found interesting. So uh, we're going to start with sin in the garden. So God creates the world. There is no sin. There is no evil, but darkness is created. So for me, God's the author of darkness and sin. Like I don't have a problem saying that. People think that it makes that bad. Again, I don't think it does. It's a confessional statement. Does it change who God is? And if we're wrong, then sorry, Lord, you didn't create darkness. But then we're wrong on the other side that God didn't create everything and there was something outside of God. So I would rather err on the side of saying nothing was outside of God and God created everything and God created darkness than say something was not God. Fair enough. No.
no, I'm kidding. Deduction.
Yeah, I mean, and this is it. God's got a logic. Jesus is called the Word, the Logos, the logic. So things are meant to make sense, and we are meant to understand them through our sense of logic and rationality because that's the way the world functions. We can't always see that logic, but by and large, it's there. So sin in the garden, I sort of understood as disobedience. There was a disobedience against the commandment. And if you have other words to go in these periods as you think about them, chime in, please. Distrust. So there was a sense of distrust in the commandment that said, all this is great, you don't need this, don't eat of this. So there's a sense of, I don't really trust what you're saying with me. And I'm trusting the witness of the serpent over and against. And then desire. They're all D's, not on purpose. But the sense of desire being, there had to have been something of wanting more.
Read.
Well, to be God.
Yeah, but I don't.
Because
Do you think
he,
Eve was like, "Oh, if I take this, I want to be God"? I don't think. I don't think that was the deal.
well, you will
But
know the goodness of sin and evil.
but knowledge of is not the same thing as a deification of a being. So, be like God, knowing good from evil. So desire to be, and they already were in the likeness of God. So it's like wanting something more. And that's like there's another D, dissatisfaction. I like that one too. I'll write these down in case I ever write a book about this.
I think you should.
Um, okay, so how about, is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
And pride didn't even come into that. Although you could maybe say pride was the root. I don't know. Is pride the root of desire? Not necessarily. Is pride the root of distrust? Maybe thinking that oneself over and against one. I know better than God. That's a sense of pride. So I think but I don't think it's reductionistic. Is easily reduced to pride, which is the standard answer. What was the first sin? Pride. And again, I think that comes from the whole Lucifer motif, that is credited as pride because it's explicitly saying that Lucifer says, "I think that I should be elevated to the place of." So that was a sense of dissatisfaction, but also, so they get kicked out. And this is where, and I think for me, where I begin with the notion of self-preservation is my idea, and I don't know why I think about this so much, but I do, the idea of just sort of being tossed out. And I know that's a very literal look at the Garden of Eden, but you don't watch too much Simpsons. But the idea of, it goes into this detail of God planting a gate, and there being a gate, and angels guarding it, so they can't get back in. Which says to me, if they weren't there, they could have waltzed back in. Because if they were some supernatural gate that shocked you when you got it, then they wouldn't want to go back in. But if God felt the need to put guards out in front, so now maybe that's just part of the folklore, maybe that's part of the mythology. I don't really care either way. They're kicked out and something different happens. And as for me, I think that's a sense of they were enfleshed in their skin and they felt the elements. And the ultimate survivor, never having spent a day, all of a sudden being thrust into this world. The first question you have is, what am I going to do to survive? How do I preserve myself? How do I protect myself? How do I care for myself? How do I keep myself safe? How do I keep myself, warm, fed?
When I think about that, I think that must have led to a lot more evil, because they had no way of knowing any of that, how they should survive. So it was all trial and error. So I think error was their teacher, and that just compounded the evil in the world.
And their logic and their sense of, they're fallen beings, so they're not.
God give them the knowledge.
Well, and so here's my side theory on that is, and this is what I toy with, I'm not confessing this is doctrine, but in the evolutionary side of my thinking, if there was a line of humanoids that came up through the primates, this is, again, I go back to the story of the Nephilim, where the sons of God, being those that come from Adam and Eve, and the daughters of the earth, those that come from primates, intermingled. That's neither here nor there, because that's a little later, but they would have had a fallen rationality. They would have not known what to do. I mean, this is the notion of covering, keeping warmth. Obviously, warmth is the one. All that's to say is, I just think there was some sense of, there was not like, it was a sin if I, maybe if I took my blanket from, if Adam took his blanket from Eve because he was cold, maybe that's a jerk move, kind of sinful, kind of selfish. But then you would say that's kind of the first sin. I mean, it had to be, the sins against God were already committed. So it's about interpersonal relations. So for me, what goes back to what is the basis of how we exist in this fallen world where we decay and die? This is, again, my whole argument of, I think the basis of sin is self-preservation.
I think the second sin was blaming Eve. Adam says, she made me do it.
Well, yeah, and what is that?
Well,
Do I need to say it, or do you need to want to say it, Jim?
No.
Self-preservation.
Yeah. Well, no. Yeah.
That's self-preservation.
Yes.
Even in the garden.
Well,
Thanks
just
for adding to
selfish.
that. Let me write that down.
Selfishness.
So they get out there. Sin's bad. People, and obviously God then comes to Noah, and he's like, "Hey, I'm done with the wickedness of people." And so what he's seeing is likely people against people. And so God sees violations happening, although people is just Lord of the Flies with everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So, but God sees it as wickedness, and so why does God see it as wickedness? I mean, you can imagine, I don't know what sort of measure of sinning went on then.
Because there was no trust on the part of anybody.
There wasn't of anyone.
No.
And everybody was getting hurt. I think it was
They were killing each other off, probably.
a whole lot of
This is a
pain
dumb
and
statement.
suffering.
But don't you think if God is so great, couldn't he have done it better?
Well, yes,
I
but
mean, that's, go ahead.
yes, that's a question that's been asked many a time. Why did God design or do the world this way? And the answer usually is love and free will. And the minute those enter did God really want, and this is why, again, we've talked about this before, process theism, that God has self-limited with enough foreknowledge, can see the infinite possibilities, but actually lives out human experience, or our worldly experience with us in space and time. So it's like sort of a virtual incarnation by placing time as a boundary for God. But the point is, God got to the point where I'm done, I'm flooding the earth. So things were bad enough that God was like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Well, if he's a God of love and all he saw was suffering,
Or evil.
in pain and
Yeah.
people suffering and being hurt all the time.
Wanted a restart.
Right. I mean, I can understand.
Mr. McKee, once again, he may hold on.
What's going on there, Dave?
Was that him talking?
No, I think something came on. So for Noah, we really don't fully understand what sin was. We just know that wickedness existed, so that God was displeased with what was going on. So God floods the earth, starts over with Noah, gives Noah the exact same covenant: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Gives them animals for food, shortens their life. Two are probably correlated more than we want to get. And then things carry on. And where do they land? Up to the Tower of Babel. That's sort of the climax that goes up. There's a lot of little things happen in between, but that goes up to the Tower of Babel. Now God's unhappy again. This time, humans are collaborating.
And he doesn't like that.
No, because in the traditional or the Reformed theological perspective on that would be that it goes against the divine covenant that God gave Noah: be fruitful, multiply, and fill. And they were drawing together. And I would say but there probably was a root of pride there, a sense of, and it does say that in the text, if we can climb to the heavens, there's a sense of, and obviously it's not even about the height of the structure, because Dubai and other structures in our world. But there was a sense of wanting, again, to be like God. Now that you get into the pride, that's where you get back into that notion of pride. But a lot of things, lots happened in the sense. Okay, after that you have Abraham. And in Abraham, his faith was credited to him as righteousness, but he was still not doing the right things. Tried to sell off his wife to, basically sort of sexual slavery to the Pharaoh or the king, just to sort of survive. And then after that, tries to, fulfill God's covenant by having, sex with his maidservant. I mean, that's just the two that were recorded. But my point is that I don't think that, we see that now with the lens of the eyes that we have, that those were problems, and that they were obviously problematic, and the Bible points in that direction too. But it doesn't say that him sleeping with Hagar was a sin per se, because it was outside his covenant of marriage. It just says that was distrust in God fulfilling it through Sarah. Now, in saying that as well, I don't know what sort of rituals went on. God could have just been like, well, yeah, I'm sure Abraham had other children at other times, and it wasn't as if this was like, but God was promising Abraham a son through Sarah. So there's a sense of distrust. Now, again, it's not about the sexual sin. The reason it was a problem is because he wasn't trusting God. So what's the sin there? Distrust, is that a sin? Distrust is hard to name as a sin. Disobedience, there's nothing to be disobedient to. Desire is not about desire. It's not about pride. Was it about pride? Abraham didn't come out as prideful, like he was fearful. But he still did the wrong thing. So, in other words, sin has not, if it feels muddy, it's because it was muddy. Sin had not been defined, and it's hard to interpret that. It's hard to interpret that without our modern day lens, or at least about the lens of the Mosaic laws, because this was prior to the Mosaic laws, several generations, hundreds of years before. Okay, so I wrote down self-focus. like, I don't know, like, again, he had this focus on, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna accomplish it, so let me go sleep with Hagar. What does that say? I don't know what that is on. I don't know. I don't remember what I wrote there, gaze on. What's that word?
But in Hebrews 11, it really praises Abraham for his faith.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say all of the New Testament does. I mean, all of Judaism does. It was credited to him, and I think it's important it was credited to him as righteousness because that's what allows us to have faith credited to us as, the gift of God for our salvation. It's not about what you do. It's not about who you are. It's not about the line you come from. So,
But his faith was totally different than what we have today.
no, I would say it's very similar. Because the God he didn't know and he came to. Everyone after him in his line didn't have to know the God. They only had to be circumcised and within the community of Israel.
Oh, that was the group thing that you're talking
Yeah,
about.
their salvation came through their connection, the bloodline, and that's why they didn't want them intermingling. But none of us do. We all come through. Anyway, so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, we see sin in all of those, but we see God using those sins. So isn't deception wrong? Yet we see, the lies that went on before Isaac to get his blessing. You see brothers throwing, Joseph into the well. You just see sin after sin. You see all these problems. Clearly, despite being claimed by God, they're not living their lives in a sense of they're self-preserving.
But did Abraham,
Self-grandizing.
I think he wasn't real clear on what God's instruction was. He was promised an heir, and then when it didn't happen, he was like, well, maybe God meant it to go this way.
Yeah.
I just think there was some.
We don't ever think about his doubt that came after. Yeah, I know. I think he probably doubted. I mean, honestly, and I go back to this before. Many think, it's a small. I shouldn't say many. But there's a minority of people, and I would include myself among them, that have questions around the narrative that God told Abraham to sacrifice his son. I tend to think that Abraham thought he was called to sacrifice his son because that's what other nations did. That's what and it was kind of like, I'm going to give you a son, and then at a certain age, you're going to sacrifice the son, and that's the submission to this divine being. And again, they were pluralist at that point. There wasn't like Yahweh was the only God. Yahweh was just the most powerful God that Abraham encountered. So, but my point is saying all of that, through all of this, from Abraham all the way to Moses, all the way to Egypt, 400 years of slavery, what's going on there? I mean, you're like, 400 years, that's older than our country. It's like to define who you are as a people. There's a lot of time there. And there probably were a lot of sins going on, but were they counted sins? I mean, and again, going back to the fact that by the time you have the Exodus and you have the Ten Commandments given, those commandments, thou shalt not commit adultery, was needed to be said. Thou shalt not steal was something that needed to be said. If they weren't doing that, God wouldn't have included that. And yes, there's some foundational things, but and obviously there are more ways that you can disrespect your neighbor or not show proper respect for your neighbor than just those 6 things. But at the same time, those things cover a large swath, and my guess is the rudimentary basis of what they all were doing in those forms of sin. Which means they're like, I'll just take this.
But cultures develop rules. So all these other countries who were worshiping other gods or whatever, they probably had a rule, don't kill people. They had a rule not to steal. And they had laws if you broke them.
I think it was more so the reason you didn't kill someone is because if you did, their brothers and sisters and their families would come out. I mean, like it was a death sentence for yourself without cause, and that's that's like law of the eye for an eye.
Yeah, it's like
what the first, what that thou shalt not kill is not like thou shalt not, really, in some sense. And this is the the paradox or the oxymoron of the whole thing is that God's saying thou shalt not kill, and then you go a couple hundred years later in the Davidic kingdom, and God's in the name of Yahweh, everyone's being slaughtered left and right. I mean, even in the Exodus, they just killed a bunch of babies. Thou shalt not kill. But you might also say those were God's decisions to lead in that, not necessarily humans' decision. When we place ourselves over and against someone, say, I'm going to take your life, it means that I'm taking something from you, as opposed to, this is the just war theory, which I don't 100% buy into. that God has sanctioned that, and obviously it can lead to a lot of disillusion. But so the law came on, and then it was so defined, not love. So sin was not loving God by not keeping the Sabbath, by blaspheming God, by using God's name in vain, loving and loving neighbor and honoring your parents. So defined sin at that point, if you want to say something that God is against, they had 10 general commandments that were grouped into things that are expression going against God, demonstrating not loving God and demonstrating not loving your neighbor, to put it in New Testament terms. That was sin. Fair enough? I mean, it's the first definition of sin. Paul refers to it as the sins before that weren't held accountable because they weren't told.
It's almost like in those times, it was God's disappointment in us not living up to our potential. It's more like we've disappointed him.
Yeah.
That because of the ambiguities that were there, that was, we weren't on the same page as him, and rather than a set of rules at that point.
And you got to think God in the midst of times looking down and thinking, will they ever get their act together?
Yeah, I mean, you can almost feel the anguish that he must have felt.
I mean, Christ is kind of another ark.
Yeah.
And has been compared to that regard as well throughout history of the church. But that notion of they can't do it on their own, so I'm going to provide salvation. But then the exciting part about that for me, again, not just as Pentecostal, but even as a Reformed theologian, the Spirit is huge.
Well, it is, because like you said, it's almost like he came to the conclusion that they cannot do it on their own. I'm going to send my son.
Yeah.
I'm going to send the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
To always be with them, so that they have the power to do it.
Yeah. Now they don't have any excuses either.
Right.
Now they can be held
The
accountable.
ambiguity is gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so things change. But in this Mosaic law, loving God, loving neighbor, they developed Levitical laws. They tease those out. Some of them are weird. Some of them are good. I actually, and I'll say this, they have a lot of blood laws. I don't practice this, but there is, as a theologian, part of me that says, I don't like, there's part of me that says we shouldn't be transferring blood from one to another. Like just from a purely spiritual sense. Read some stuff about blood codes, also that,
Like in transfusions?
even in transfusions, like there's part of me, I mean, I've given a lot of blood. Blood donations saved Shannon's life from an ectopic pregnancy. She had 4 of her, you have 6 quarts in 6 units in your body, 4 of hers drained down into her belly when she had an ectopic pregnancy. Yeah, she was in the hospital when it happened. But all that's to say is I've been giving back blood ever since, and I give a few extra pints just for good measure. But even doing that, and I'm a donor, even doing that theologically, I do question whether we're really supposed to be doing that.
I don't understand that at all.
Why? Well, because you look back at the Old Testament law and the notion, and then look at the Levitical laws around blood. Blood was a pretty there was something about blood. Blood is the lifeline. Without blood, you die.
But we don't follow those.
No, we don't, and I don't think it's a sin to use. That's what I'm saying. Well, I do it, and I don't think it's a sin. I don't participate in sin. I'm just saying, as an aside, there is something about blood being transferred that gives me pause.
We'll talk about that.
Okay, we'll talk about that.
Well, there's even the blood oath, or where the people would cut their hands and then shake hands to mix their blood, the
And they thought that,
seals.
yeah.
Blood brothers.
The meaning and the symbol. I mean, but the blood is central to our understanding of faith.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Blood shed.
Yeah.
We drink the blood of Christ. I mean, you really think you drink the blood of
I
Christ?
don't do that.
You don't drink. You don't take communion with. You're like the worst Catholic ever.
He takes the bread.
Why don't you just
I
be?
take the bread.
Why don't you just be a Presbyterian and get it over with?
Because I don't believe in that one major thing. No. I'll
Sin?
never be. Yeah.
All right.
Wait a minute, she's pulling me back.
I know. Okay, Davidic kingdom. We don't see a lot of sin in David. David's portrayed pretty well. This is about a
Yeah,
thousand
she-
1000 BC
Except-
until
Yeah.
I wasn't done yet. I was a dramatic pause. Until Bathsheba.
Yeah.
And Bathsheba isn't a sexual sin. I mean, it is kind of, but it's really not at the core of it.
Really?
Oh no, this is a sin. This is
The plot.
it's
and
more than
Conspiracy.
far more than
I mean, it ended up in murder.
he had 1,000 concubines because David wanted what he couldn't have. So it was a true sense of violation of the commandment of adultery, but it wasn't about lust of the flesh as much as it was about lust of power, an extension of power. And in fact, the one of the things I love about that passage in 2 Samuel says that when other kings go off to war, David remained at home. And I was always preaching, I think it is an appropriate sermon, that he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing. I remember as a kid, I said, when you in your life stop, you take your gaze off of what you're supposed to be doing and what you're called to, you fill it in with other things, idle time. So he's there idly looking down, but he had 1,000. I mean, there were concubines everywhere. This was not about seeing something beautiful and wanting to want.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I'm sure there was lust combined in that, but that wasn't the root sin. If David was just looking to have some sex with someone who wasn't his wife, he could have done that in 1,000 different places.
Well, somebody made her pretty hard to say no to.
Well, I mean,
Something happened there that,
well, and then you say in the providence of God did,
Was
but
it her problem? No, I don't think so.
was it her fault?
her
Yeah,
fault?
no, it's not.
Yeah, well, it sounded-
She shouldn't have been so beautiful.
yeah.
No, and honestly, and even in that sense, like nudity and bathing and there was a much more David danced in the temple naked. We have weird taboos around bodies now in ways that they didn't then. So the other side of that is I don't think it was like he saw her half naked down on a patio and was like, oh, look at that, and then got into his mind. I think, and probably he was just used to saying, hey, I like her, I'm going to have some sex with her, as opposed to, and then it was the fact that she was married. Maybe he knew that, maybe we don't get the story filled in, but the violation was obviously in an adulterous way because he was taking another man's wife, even in the Mosaic sense. And then he went on to double down on that, and he had Uriah murdered. And you combine all of that, and where's the sin? Pride. I think I wrote pride. Your pride. What other? Greed,
Greed, lust,
lust, power.
power.
I kind of feel like power
Yeah.
and domination and I am the king.
I can do anything
I can
want.
do whatever I want.
And my position purifies my action or justifies.
Justifies my actions.
Sounds like true. I'm sorry.
He sounds like Trump.
Yeah.
So, but my point in saying that is, well, perhaps every evil king that came through the history of Israel as well, and every tyrant in history. Power is the root of
Yeah.
many evils in this world.
Mhm.
Even power, even to bring it down on a personal level, the last argument you had with your spouse, as you're both sitting with them, how many times do we get in a frustration, or just anyone you argue with, how many arguments are really about power in the end? I want my position to dominate your position.
Yeah.
I want to feel better about myself than I want you to feel better about yourself. I mean, that's what bullying is. Overextension of power, dominance. So you move into that, and then so David goes on to Solomon, and Solomon is the wisest, and so Solomon feels like leveling things out. But when Solomon passed, Solomon's got 1,000 concubines, so sexual sin is not the issue. Infidelity in a relationship is not a norm in the sense of the kingship, and I would imagine polygamy probably existed elsewhere. And this is why I've always gone back to the fact that if you're going to define a biblical understanding of marriage, it can only come from the New Testament and Paul's understanding of things. So sin, and so what happened is then again, Jeroboam, Rehoboam split the kingdom, northern and southern. Northern is Israel, southern is Judah. There are all sorts of kings in the north that are evil. In the south, there are 12 out of 8 are evil. So evil reigns for many, many, many years to the point that they are exiled. The north goes into Babel or Assyria, the south and Judah goes into Babylon, which eventually becomes Persia. And in this, like they're, whatever was going on in these evil kingdoms, you can clearly see, I mean, sky's the limit. I think we're back to a time, I think we go through these periods of debauchery in our world, and this is the period of debauchery. They're in exile for 70 years. They're being returned. Now, all of a sudden, this is a major shift in how we think about sin. Because now all of these Israelites are going back to Jerusalem, back to Israel, and they're having to redefine who they are after spending several hundred years in broken generational sin, being exiled as a punishment for that, picking up all the Persian things, picking up all the the Babylonian things, and they all come back. So what is sin? Excuse me. I mean, you have the Ten Commandments, and there you have the Levitical law. Those are all still intact. But that now feels kind of legalistic. You haven't been doing these things, and you come back, and all of a sudden you got to do all these things. They weren't passed down from generation to generation.
Did they practice when they were in?
Some did, some didn't. There were some devout who could in the ways they could, I'm sure. And there's some, I mean, that's the notion of Daniel and the lion's den.
Sure.
Also something that was projected in exile. I mean, whether it was true or not, people think it was just a story created by the Great Assembly, apocalyptic literature to teach something. But I don't really care either way if it's real or not. For me, what it teaches is the faithfulness of God. But those were stories in Esther and Job, the reestablishment of the Torah. These were things they were trying to teach. So they're going to base it primarily out of law. And my point in saying this is, as much as the laws and the Levitical law existed and there was a community that surrounded you, have this massive break in this time of exile. And when you return, you're now returning to a very literal, legalistic understanding of what you should and shouldn't do. The relationship has been broken for Israel with God, and they're trying to reestablish it. They reestablish through practices, and one of the biggest things they're trying to do is reestablish Jewish identity. What does it mean to be a Jew? Well, being a Jew means being faithful in following the Torah. But what I'm trying to communicate is, in this 70-year period, or probably throughout the centuries that on both ends of it, the relationship that they had with God through all of the kings and prophets and judges and patriarchs was always based in a relationship with God. And these laws were given to them so they would flourish, and that was how they demonstrated they were God's people. That's how they demonstrated their identity, but the relationship was established. So when that break comes, they're just doing it legalistically. Again, it's like someone grabbing a group of us saying, hey, we're going to go reestablish Christianity. These are the things you're supposed to do. That's just not how humans function. I mean, they can adapt, but it's like being taken from your land and saying, this is your new life. So.
But rebuilding the temple was a big part of their focus too, wasn't it?
It was reestablishing and
they wanted a place where they could worship. I mean, they may not have had a complete understanding of what that should have been, but
no, they would have. I mean, the scriptures and they hadn't law. I mean, there was still remnant. It's not like they would abandon stuff, and there were still there. And honestly, there was there were still the Samaritans were still there. They never left. That would actually make a really good movie. You should do something about a monologue about being the last Samaritan standing. Just anyway. All right. So then, so they reestablish identity through the law. And one of my point in this is that the 400 years, and so basically around that time when they're reestablished, you have you're leading up to what year would that be? You have Elijah, you have Elisha, you have King Nebuchadnezzar, you have Baal, you have, I'm trying to think of the order in my head. But you get to this point, Ahab and Bathsheba, or Beelzebub, that's not right. drawing a blank right now, but there's a point where we enter into this 400-year period where the prophets stop. And by this point, the law is firmly established. And so when you think about the legalism of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the ruling class, the reason, what I'm trying to get at, and the way they understand sin in that era, it goes back to the fact that when they came back from exile and they reestablished the focus on purity and righteousness and being a Jew, being a part of this nation, was adherence to these laws that were set out. So the stage was set for legalism. Is my largest point. So Christ comes on the scene. He comes into a legalistic environment, and because of the Maccabees and everything that went on in the intertestamental period, there's also this sense of wanting a Davidic king to come back. There's confusion in that. Christ gets caught up in that, but Christ does something interesting. And it hasn't changed because the Spirit's not present and Christ hasn't died, but he foreshadows on what it will be when he says things like, and I've talked about these over the past few weeks of sin, it sins in your mind, it's in your heart, it's a condition of who you are. It's not just in what you do. But Christ also doesn't say that actions don't matter. He says to the rich man, go sell your possessions. And so actions matter, but ultimately Christ moves from an outward sense of sin that is legalistic, as again defined from the time of exile up to the time of Christ as being the standard, even for the folk. I mean, it would just be, and I'm sure things were still happening, but it was defined in that way. When Christ says, actually, that's not how we're defining the law. The law actually is the minimum, but he doesn't put it in that way. The law becomes like, well, if you're really serving me, the things that the law describes are just the beginning. Don't just not have sex with your neighbor's wife, but don't even think about it. And when you see, and if you feel a sense of draw to that, maybe literally pluck out your eye. But what it's really saying is don't let that ever be a part of who you are. Pluck it out so that cast it from you, so it doesn't creep up. So there's something major that happens in Christ's teaching around the understanding of sin. We're going from a massive understanding, a cultural understanding, and it hasn't been spread to anyone else. It's just a Judaic understanding. And Christ comes on the scene and he challenges the notion of that legalism, challenges the notion of adherence to the law, and says there's much deeper, it's much more, and suggests that it's going to be personal. It's doing and it's also thinking, in the sense of going back to my speeding example. Just because you don't speed doesn't mean you believe you shouldn't speed. And what he's saying is believe that you shouldn't speed. Because if we were truly operating, all of us, in the sense of what is best for the world, would be, I'm going to follow that speed limit because that is what now you might, and then you argue about ethics. Well, that's the cultural ethics. That's a group of people I don't know made that decision. And obviously it's not a sin, but in some sense it is, because if you're speeding, you can get a ticket for it. It's a violation. It's a breaking of a law, but is it a sin before God? I don't want to go that far. But it's definitely Christ, and I think this is where I think the notion of self-preservation doubles down and it resurfaces, because through all of these, I would say there's not a whole lot of self-preservation. I mean, it's at the basis of it. Why does David send Uriah out? Self-preservation. Why did the brothers put Joseph into the pit and sell him into slavery? They wanted self-preservation, self-exaltation, self-care, self.
So could I bring up my question now about the whole issue of self-preservation?
Yes.
My daughter is a high school biology teacher, and I happened to be talking on the phone with her, and we got to talking about this whole issue of sin and how you define it. And as a biology teacher, she says, but self-preservation is innate in all living organisms. It is, God created us with that urge to survive.
Yeah.
All living things.
Yeah.
And teaching it from a point of view of biology, that's part of being a living.
No, I hear that argument.
Okay, so I would prefer a word like self-aggrandizement to self-preservation.
That's a big word for it's not as
know,
catchy.
Maybe it's not.
That you give it self.
No.
I'm sure we can have a better word. I think for me, well, and I think, and yes, you're right, because it's not just self-preservation, because me wanting to say warm is not a sin, but if the curse of sin comes in the form of our enfleshment in this world, and this is where you got to jump in with my little bit of noodling with my, this is skin that God gave us in that. But if we were cast into a world of where there's self-preservation needed, that is part of the condition that we're cast into.
But I think before sin, God created Adam and Eve with an innate sense of self-preservation, because that's part of
I don't see
being
that.
alive.
I don't see
And I
that though.
think the animals were created with a sense of self-preservation.
Well, one, I think that, and this goes back to, and again, I'm just, this is me noodling more than it is me asserting. In my visual of the earth, and one, I believe in Pangea, the whole notion of that everything, all the continents fit together at one point, like that just, you know, scientifically, it's like too close. And especially when you start to see cultures, and being a Filipino, and you know, really a sort of seeing where the Philippine, you know, we have a lot of common with indigenous people in the in our country, and also, and so there was this sandwiching there of cultures. All that's to say is one space, one island hasn't broken up, and it eventually does. But the sense of there's almost like this garden, the paradise garden, is an actual location in the earth, but it is in some sense a separated bubble. Because if there was a boundary that you could get in and out that was being guarded, unless it was this sort of invisible wall that went around, like the Invisible Woman or something like that, or Jet, like there, you know, and again, I recognize that that's me taking a literal picture that the scriptures are painting for me. You know, guards with flaming swords. This was just, and it's like, you know, this is the extra. Like, what, really? Did they need flaming swords? I think if I was immortal and there was this angelic guard preventing me from getting in this, would I really try to bum rush it? And well, I was going to, but that flaming sword is, you know, if you didn't have that flaming sword, put that flaming sword down and then we'll see what happens.
The lightsaber.
Yeah, there's a lightsaber. I love it. I'll tell Silas you said that. There you go. No, but but for me, that there's a sense of their needs were met there. And I think, you know, when I think of Jacob's ladder and the notion of the stairway, I also think that's Garden of Eden. Almost as if, and again, I'm a little bit of, there's a little sci-fi there, almost as if that space and that connection to the atmosphere is the portal through which the supernatural and the divine enter into this world. I'm not saying that's really what I think, but in the visual of that there's something unique about this space that Israel is in, because that is where God planted this garden.
You see, I don't believe in the garden.
Oh, again, bad
I know,
Catholic.
Bad Catholic.
That's what you should write your
Well,
next
I
play.
believe.
I've talked to other Catholics who believe it's a myth to explain
the
God's.
beginning of God.
And I'm on both sides of that too. I think I hold it as myth, and I also hold it as legit. I think I play with it literally, but I hold it with a myth looseness, a looseness. My grip is light, because again, how do I know? I mean, like, you know, Jordan Peterson's explanation of the psychology of Moses when he wrote that, you know, like dreams and sequences and all these things. And I think that all happens with human psychology. I think it's very interesting. And I think God can intervene in that. So at the same time, they're humans and there are errors. And I don't think God's coming in correcting every single one of our errors. And I have no reason to think that happened necessarily. But Jews hold that those books were given by Moses and were given. So whether it was an imaginative place, it is still upon which the principles of that narrative of creation and what happened there that we base all of Christian theology. Yeah. Who God is, sin, our fallenness, our need for a Savior, who Jesus is, the second Adam. The recapitulation that happens in the reverse, the curse, and the reverse of that curse and the Spirit, all of these things play into that. So the minute you deny that and you just say it's just sort of a loose narrative, you unravel all of this.
Yeah, I don't see how you could do that.
Well, at the same time, I believe
Jim's, he's like he said,
I'm a Catholic.
I'm going to write a play for him called Bad Catholic.
Bad teacher, bad Catholic.
No, you're a good teacher.
Um,
You're good. You're
honey,
you're a
I
good
can
Catholic.
talk.
Yeah.
I'm not telling you.
She's
that.
comforting you because I'm insulting your Catholicism.
Usually when she does this,
But here's what happens is Jesus takes all of this narrative of law and he flips it on its head and he says it's much deeper than that. And not now, again, the communal thing, individual thing. The sign of the covenant, circumcision, male oriented, sign of the covenant, New Testament, baptism, Eucharist, both available to all households. This is why we baptize children. So the entire narrative is flipped. And for me, in my thinking, it says, Spirit is restored, the curse has been broken. The curse that God placed on Adam and Eve, which is why I hold it to it as an actual narrative. Curse has been broken. What was it like before the curse? Well, there was still order with Adam and Eve, but they were in a more reciprocal, mutual. I mean, they stood before God. They both bore the image of God. They both cared for the garden. They're both doing it. So for me, recovery of the brokenness is a recovery of that relationship. So yeah, every time patriarchy throughout history of humanity is 100% sin because it's largely power. But again, part of the curse. But the challenge of that curse is overcoming that. So I drew a line here just because that after the Holy Spirit, everything shifted, and we're talking. So I'll go through these and I'll read these words, and if you want me to dig into them a little bit more, but I want to go through, and then I want to give about 15 minutes at the end for us just to chat about whatever you want to chat about. But so we go from sin and the Holy Spirit and it was pretty stark at first, like Ananias and Sapphira lied and they got struck down for it. But I think what happened with the Greek influence is we started seeing this more mystical view of sin. It wasn't just about the law, it was about the internal nature. And so when the early church starts defining it, they start talking about it as being innate. Like they're philosophizing about how we have sin in us for the first time. It wasn't just something that being faithful, it was something that we had to avoid. And this is strong Greek Hellenistic thinking. Humans are flawed, gods are not. We need to overcome our flaws. And you see this sort of, and it's an innate flaw. And so they're designing the thinking around how we understand sin in us. Original sin comes out. It's inclusive of everyone. No one escapes it. It's completely an ability. They're debunking, they're debunking any notion of, in early church, you have a guy named Pelagius who basically said we're born without sin, and then we learn sin. And that's why these doctrines come into play, because they're saying, no, it's so innate to us. We need to name it, and we need to figure out how to overcome it. So that leads us all the way up through Gregory the Great, who defines the 7 deadly sins. It passes on through the next 200 years. You get St. Thomas Aquinas, who takes the 7 deadly sins, turns it into a much more sophisticated understanding of sin. And interestingly enough, and again, St. Thomas Aquinas is in the medieval period, it's still innate, still original, but now they started to categorize it. The 7 deadly sins. And Aquinas, who lived 1225 to 1274, so just to put him in the time frame, what was happening, developed the notion of confession and penance. And if you look back and when the Catholic Church or the Western Church started having official confession before a priest, 13th century.
They adopted it from the Irish.
Well, I don't know. Well, I can't speak to that.
I mean, the type of confession where you go to a priest.
Go to a priest, maybe. I mean, but Thomas Aquinas writes about this. So then you have, again, it spirals. Dante takes this notion of confessus, penance, purgatory, all these things that were being developed through scholasticism, and then you have the layers of sin, of hell. You have categorizations of sin. You have the punishment for sin being portrayed, and everyone takes Dante's Divine Comedy as being almost probably tantamount to biblical authority.
Yeah.
Which gives rise to the point that now what are we back into? We're back into a period of legalism. In the Christian church, though, there's a lot of ambiguity, and again, I don't want to take it too lightly or ignore it. 1054, Great Schism between the East and the West. Rome is now defining itself from 1050, so 1100, just say the 1100, to this period, and it was about 200 years. The Catholic Church is defining its practices, it's defining who it is, it's building its sense of structure. And they have thinkers that are coming in and providing writings, and this is where you get Thomas Aquinas, you get it further down, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in the 13th, 14th century, 15th century, where you're talking about indulgences, you're talking about paying for confession, you're talking about all these things that really sin has become a commodity. Or they've commodified the whole sin repentance structure for the sake of maybe good or bad. I don't know, I'm probably bad, but it was good. We still like to go to the churches and look at them. We like to take a picture of what it ultimately was from the abusive church. But during that period, I think that sin comes to a point where they're not really concerned so much with the breaking of the relationship with God as much as they are as defining and controlling people's behavior for the benefit of the financial gain and power of the church. And this is absolute power. When the church controls your future, your afterlife, where you're going to spend eternity, that's a lot of power. And we can't even imagine that because we don't live in that era. But to someone in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, if the church said they were going to hell, that was it. Despite the fact that that's not what Scripture says. But no one could read. So Reformation comes along, we always talk about this, printing press comes along, people start reading, people start thinking. Now all of a sudden you have Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and reformers coming out, and they redefine sin. Again, a stark turn from something that you have to free yourself from and has a list of things all these things you're trying to avoid. All of it's wiped off, almost off the table, and now it's talked about as depravity, it's rooted in unbelief, it's rebellion against God. And you have this beginning of this existential understanding of who they were, because it was a condition they found themselves. Yes, now was there still, you shouldn't do all these things 100%, but not because they were laws that were given by the church, but because they were understanding them and communally at that point discerning them from Scripture. But again, I think all the basics are still going to be there. No one's going to deny the Ten Commandments at any point throughout the history of the church. But then you have the Enlightenment, it comes on. And I wrote down, I think this was, I don't remember who it was now. That which is not, so the sin becomes this existential category of that which is not. Now we're back into philosophy at the beginning of the time, the beginning of the world of God, that which is not God. But the sin is that which is not God. So God is holy, God is pure. Again, some Greek sort of exaltation of this perfect being, but God is this, and that which is not God, that which is opposed to God. So it's big categories. A state of despair, it's called. A disorder in the human consciousness. Alienation from the universe, and rejection of God. So the Enlightenment takes this notion of God, and think about where it's been. It used to be relationship, then it was legalism to establish identity, then it was individually located. And then it moves through slow categorization and systematization. So now it becomes a rejection of God. So, and in the midst of this, you have the early settling, and you have people who are not Christians for the first time. You have not a secular nation, but when you're coming out of the continent of Europe, that was the Holy Roman Empire, that was either Roman Catholic or Protestant after the Reformation. You have a couple years out, now you have people who are like, we don't got to do this anymore. It's not a state religion. I don't have to do it to have citizenship. So you have this whole new category of people who are like, and I'm not saying they're running around sinning, but now sin takes on a little bit of a new turn. So Great Awakening, 1735, 1805, 1888, 1965, whatever, they all sort of point back to the first two when we talk about it. But this is where sin was largely understood as sin was a separation from God in moral unrighteousness. And the separation from God, I don't want to say it goes back to that time, but this is that notion that we often have been referred to as like the chasm that exists between us. We're separated from God, and then Jesus becomes the cross that goes in between. You never seen that? That was always on tracks growing up. Moral unrighteousness, doing that which is unrighteous, doing that. And again, I think that there is some sense of, no one's saying it's self-preservation, keep in mind. No one's saying it's these set laws. It's a general moral unrighteousness. And we start to develop in our own systems laws that are sins that are okay and not okay. as there always have been. But as culture develops around the Great Awakening in the US, you also have this culture that when the state is no longer defining what sin is for you, remember in Europe, they're like, this is what sin is. You don't have a choice. Like, we tell you what it is. Even in the Reformation, you still have some of that. New nation, new definitions. So we're redefining sin in this new nation, and the Great Awakenings define it as both existential and also practical against your neighbor. And they're taking it from Scripture. But is gossiping a sin? Yes, gossiping is a sin. It's clearly defined in Scripture as a sin. Why is it a sin? What if, maybe what if you're saying something true? Well, is it necessary to tell the person? Are you bringing light into the world? Are you hurting someone else? Is your spirit in the right place? You can take all of these things down to the base root of why do people gossip? Is it self-preservation? Self-interest is probably is the most basic, probably just more, self-interest. I guess preservation just is from that early sense of, of being thrust out of the world. Preservation seems like that first condition, but that's self-interest.
Well, I know aggrandizement is not maybe a easy term to use, but it means seeking power and riches.
Yeah.
And seeking for oneself above others. So
it does,
whatever term you want, you want.
I don't know what's best. I don't think for me, I guess I don't see the first sin of Cain and Abel as being grandizing themselves as much as, and maybe the notion of I don't think self-preservation is a sin per se. I think it is a symptom or a indicator of the sinful condition we are in.
If you try to preserve yourself above others, because we should love others as ourselves. So,
but it's only when there's not enough to go around,
yeah.
or there's fear for not enough to go around. Because if you stick, if every kid gets stuck into a gymnasium and there's just cotton candy pouring out of all, the windows. This is a weird metaphor. Just coming to mind. I'm visualizing. Whatever. There's an endless supply of cotton candy for all the kids. No one then gets. Obviously, once the sugar kicks in, they might get a little Lord of Flies. But but my point is that no one. But when everyone's needs are met, this is the notion of the garden. They didn't have to be self-interested because their food was provided for them. There was no fear of harm. I don't think they had skin in the same way we do that felt cold, and it was like they lay down wherever you want. Who knows if they slept or not slept, but they didn't lack. There was no need, so there was no need to self-preserve because everything was being provided. This is the abundance notion. This is what the afterlife will be. Mm-hmm. We won't have need. We won't have lack. We won't lack. We won't have to self-preserve. And when you're in that place, when you don't lack, that's when the place where if nothing lacking, then you're in a place where you can constantly start to, and if you're created in that self-giving way. And for me, it's again going back to that notion of the self-giving nature of the perichoretical Trinity is constantly giving to oneself. That's what makes it function. If everyone in the world only thought of everyone else, the world would be amazing. And we're like, we can't even imagine how you'd function your day like that. But theoretically, if the moment we woke up, we were just like, how can I serve you? How can I do this? How can I? And you're like the same. How can I serve you? You'd be like those two squirrels in the cartoons. After you. No, after you. I insist, after you.
No, you go.
There was some of
No,
that
you go.
in the early church when it said they had all things in common.
I think, yeah. And I think that, and honestly, I think that that's probably, and this goes back to this world isn't our own. If we really were living in that sense of God was coming back next year, none of us, we could all bring our money to the church. Everyone that connected to this church could all bring their money, and there would be so much for everyone, and there would be so much more that to even go beyond us as a community. Is that what God has called? This is my fascination with intentional Christian community. This is what got me to say in the beginning, as I was fascinated with Christian communes, and I started studying intentional Christian communities, led me, and Tizé was part of that original research. But the notion that and this is why I said, I would love for us as a community here in Lake City to function more in that way. It's like, I remember, when we did the materials thing, Roy Shaw was saying, I've got 9 circular saws. Because, I don't have any circular saws. I don't need to go out and buy a circular saw because he's got 9 of them. But he's like,
Well,
and, you know,
everybody, and everybody's house has everything they need. I mean,
and honestly, it's probably not really meant to be that way. Now, are we sinning in that? You know, probably in some sense we, you know, maybe in some general sense we are.
Wasteful.
It's wasteful. It's excessive.
Yeah.
We know we don't have to do it, but it's our own pride that doesn't want to like share or doesn't want, you know. I mean, I have 500 plus board games, and I try to open them up. But even when I'm like, if I have to lend to someone, I'm like, hey, wash your hands when you play this.
do not have snacks
eat
at
while
your
you're-
Don't eat
table.
while you're playing my games. You can do what you want once I give it to you. If it's your, oh, you can, see your flip seven's all sticky, probably because you were eating gummy bears. But my point in all of that is, anyway, we'll circle back to this, but we're jumping ahead. Let me just finish these real shifts. So Great Awakening, sin was separation from God. Then what happens after that? We have from the Great Awakenings, we have this restoration and holiness movement, and then sin took that moral and righteous. They took that moral and righteousness and interjected this notion that sin were impurities of body and spirit. And so you infuse all of a sudden in Puritanism and Pentecostalism or holiness or restorationist movements all came down to digging much deeper into a legalistic understanding. In the very same way, it's how your behavior defines your belonging, not your belief. Now, your belief should define your behavior. And so, you know, obviously there's the intermingling of those terms. Modern evangelicalism took that, and that's where that notion of the sin being a chasm, and that's where, like in the last century, tracts, that was a huge thing. I mean, Bibles had it, you know, it was like, you're on this side, God's on this side, and Jesus is the bridge that goes in the middle that you can walk across and be reunited with God. Hoo-hoo. By the way, I hope it was not a view, but when I was dropping my dog poop off at the stand today, someone left a Bible in a track.
Oh.
And I was like, are they trying to get rid of these, or are they trying to witness?
No.
So I took it with me because I thought if you're getting rid of it, that's sad. I don't think that's what it is. And if
Maybe
you're
they laid it down to deposit the
No, I don't
poo.
think so. If it was just a Bible, maybe, or just a track, but the track kind of tipped me off. But I was like, someone's trying to witness to someone through this track while they're dropping off their dog poop. Like, I bet that's what Jesus had in mind when he said, go proclaim.
Well,
Anyway, if someone's watching this and you did this, I'm sorry, but
I don't know if this fits in modern evangelicalism, but in the state of Texas, they've been trying to pass the law that the 10 Commandments have to be posted in every classroom.
Yeah.
It's been appealed, as I understand it, by several school districts. So, right now, but only those school districts that are part of that appeal are really legally immune at the point. My daughter's school district hasn't done it.
Yeah.
She didn't know what she was gonna do if they had to, you know, she had to post this in her classroom. What are you supposed to do with this, you know?
Yeah.
But her district says, we're short of money for so many things, we can't even get school supplies.
Yeah.
We can't afford to be printing out and posting all this stuff, so they're not doing it either.
Well, I
But
would,
it's a
yeah.
new kind of legalism.
It is a
isn't
new
it?
type of legalism, and I think it's there's a certain level of there's a simplicity of thought that says if we post these, we'll look like a moral nation, and two, that somehow just seeing those that our children will gather. But when Texas has laws that, you know, call for capital punishment, and yet on the walls of your schools it says thou shalt not kill, and it doesn't give exception at that, what you're doing is actually creating cognitive dissonance in the child's mind of saying, how do we have to have this in the wall, but yet what you do is completely opposite of that. No, I think that's a yes. I think that's an exemplification of it's a return. I mean, I think legalism is what drove us all the way through. Legalism was the attempt, or a legalistic understanding of sin and salvation was an attempt in the face of a beginning of European secularism creeping over into what our nation was at the time, a fear factor, a response. And so, I mean, we see that now. We know it's more secular. Let's double down on, well, that's what Christian nationalism comes out. It's because it's a fear of, and it's a misunderstanding. It's a reductionistic understanding that God even remotely cares about the countries that we live in. I mean, beyond just the general care. But that legalism led to a boom in the 70s, in our 50s, 60s, 70s, where the whole notion of postmodernity and the sexual revolution, and everything was challenged, and knowledge was challenged, and truth was challenged.
Authority.
And the response of the boomer and silent generation were mega churches, and you could also argue that was I would say a sin. I would say largely what the silent and boomer generation did with church, and not a sin that was, again, not a sin that I think they're going to be like, oh, you sinned and you need forgiveness of this, maybe not, but the notion that church needed to be like a business. It was placing human standards of effectiveness, success, and faithfulness and goodness, and it was put an overlay. And so it was just in an era where everything was growing, everything was building, culture started controlling the church and our mentality of and I think that coming out of that era, I think we're in an era now where what we've done is we've deconstructed everything. There's no truth across the board of what sin is. Honestly, one of the biggest things that I have challenged with the younger generation in this Christian culture we have here is sexual involvement really doesn't have many boundaries. Like before or after marriage. Even after marriage, I think there is some sense of fidelity there. But I think that even amongst evangelical Christians, and in particular mainline Christians, I don't know, I can't speak to the Catholics, to be honest with you. I think there's probably still some enculturation that keeps that. But even so, but I think that the level of promiscuity of sexual expression in our culture is off the charts. And I don't blame the generation itself to some extent, because pornography is available, in ways that it never was 20 years ago. The shows, the sexuality, you can't walk in the mall without seeing, a giant Victoria's model where, the bra is bigger than your car. I just wanted to go to Foot Locker and get some new shoelaces. It's like Christ. Yeah. It's like Christ tour through the desert. No, I think my point in saying all this, and this brings us to the question, really ultimate, the present day, is what is sin? We don't know. Sin's changed. All of these, sin the definition of sin has changed. The understanding of sin has changed. Our relationship with sin has changed. Our understanding of the punishment of sin has changed. And we're in an era right now where truth is really very relative. And although we're trying to seek and try to claim for some truth, the minute we start to say truth, what is truth? Well, then we go to the scripture. Scripture defines this. And then we say, well, then you run into the challenge of, as fallen creatures, how do we interpret scripture? Do we interpret it literally? Do we interpret it figuratively? Do we do it metaphorically? That didn't really happen. How do we find any sense of cohesion of what sin is and how do we avoid that? And for me, and this is, I think, where this whole process, and honestly, what really started all of this was me wrestling with homosexuality and saying, what is that? It is something, and it really came into play when it was talking about the natural and unnatural. Jim and I have talked about this, and I don't think there's something just because I think there are thousands of things that we do right now that are unnatural in our lives and in the way God created us. I think Paul is talking about one as an example of sin, but not to pinpoint it and to point a finger at it. And again, I've said this before, I think that there is far more sin because there are more heterosexuals and heteros. I think if you want to put a sin, sort of thermometer, homosexual sin's here, heterosexual sin is out the roof. And yet we take all of the rights and we reduce all of the grace for here because this is part of the biology of the nature of humanity, of Homo sapiens, and we reject this. Whereas I really understand homosexuality in its sense of the covenantal relationship, not in the sense of just its sexual promiscuity, which again, I said is a problem both heterosexual across the board in our world right now and in our nation right now, the Western in particular. But that notion of And I think that really just comes from a rejection of all, I think that goes back to I think I wrote that down, that I think we're in a place of deism, that the things that we do don't really matter, the little things we do. And I think that's characterized things throughout the history of the world. But for me, it came down to the minute we start nitpicking, and we did this, the categorization that started really from Gregory the Great, 6th, 7th century, 7 deadly sins. These sins are worse. Well, now we have a system, and then we start grading them, and then we, even though we don't have those, and we say grace exists overall, we as Western Christians with evangelical tint, with, or mainline, whatever we have all sorts of ways we judge everyone else.
But we don't ourselves.
But we don't ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think this is, and Christ didn't come into the world to condemn it. Christ came into the world to shed light. And I think that it's only when we start to be internal and say, everything about me is crappy. When I didn't pick up that wrapper, I know that I'm messing with people's heads because I'm messing with my own head.
I picked up some trash.
And how did you? And don't you think about that in that moment?
About it all the
I'm
time.
gonna not be selfish, and I'm gonna pick up this trash.
No, I just think Jason made me do that.
And see, because you're Catholic, the legalism still you can't bring it out of your head. But my point in that is that the reason I think that we're supposed to find sin in self-preservation and self-interest and not self-giving. And I think that there's gospel precedent, there's biblical precedent for it, because when we get to the place where we say everything about us is broken, we're just always watching out for ourselves, and that's not how we're going to be. Mm. Then all of a sudden you say, and this is where the beginning of Romans comes into, who am I to point a finger at anything that person is doing? When I look at my homosexual brothers and sisters, and I worked with many of them in the national office, they're in covenanted marital relationships where they want to experience intimacy and love and connection, and they're in and I think, you know what? The God I serve, I believe, has grace for that, because that is Paul's notion of the conscience. They're living and they're proclaiming the gospel and love. And is it perfect? No, but none of our stuff is perfect. Broken relationships left and right all over the place. And for me, it comes down to not categorizing sin, because the minute we start categorizing, then we're trying to find ourselves in this spectrum to say, self-justifying, this is where I fall and I'm okay.
And you're not.
And you're not.
Yeah.
And what I want to say is we're all shitty.
We're all in it.
There's no getting out of that.
We step in it every day.
Every day, we reap like it.
Yeah.
And this is the message of grace.
I keep thinking, we've lived through several of those phases, and we can relate to that. I would love to be a fly on the wall or even participate, but to hear young people having the same conversation about what is sin. And I think we would see some marked differences.
Oh, yeah.
And you know what I would say to that? And I think that, and this is indicative of exactly what you're saying. I did when I was in New Wilmington a few jobs ago in Pennsylvania, I did a couple week series on swearing, cursing. It was 2 weeks, I think. And we got them, and they got to write. They said, this is a safe space. It was just for the high schoolers. I told the parents I was doing. I said, your kids are going to probably say some words, and they may say it in private, but they don't say. And then we're going to get them out. And so I said, we're going to name them, and I'm writing them on the board, and they're saying, dropping the F-bomb, and there are leaders there. So we have this big list of words, and everyone's giggling. We're all just getting past the awkwardness of the fact that language are just symbols, and we bring the meaning to them. But when I ask people to rank them, the older generations, those who I would say are touched by American evangelicals and the legalism there, the F word was the worst word that you could possibly say, and then it gradiated from there. Then it was like taking the goddamn or something like that. It just sort of dropped off from there, and then no one really cared about some of the others. Whereas the young people, the F word was way down the list. That was like, who cares? Like, that's just a word. And the N word and the British C word were the two top words. And part of that, I think, is because those words fracture relationships. And what we see in this generation in particular, with the result of the evangelical movement saying, Christianity or relationship with God is about a relationship. I just think it's true. I just think that was an overemphasis, perhaps, that the words that they chose were words that broke, that marginalized, that, diminutized, or, made someone less than. So again, going back to the legalism of a word that we think and we associate with badness versus one that actually has, some wrestling with it.
So they would probably, if they were to categorize sins, they would be looking for the relationship destroyers or impairments.
Yeah, I think so. And I think sexuality for them is not really a problem, because I think they see, and I think that there's a sense of eminent nature in and sort of, I'm here, this is my life in this world. Like, this is why they're so free with tattoos, free with piercings. My body is here as a palette, not really a sense of that, that I'm a vessel, that and I don't have a problem, obviously, with tattoos, but I think that sense of materialism, that sense of eminent nature of self, says I'm going to experience the pleasure of this day. But I think we're coming out of this. I think the pendulum is now. I think we've swung to a place where we're seeing we're seeing the heightened of the debauchery of humanity, in the sense of what every psychologist, every sociologist, every philosopher, every theologian, everyone in some sort of higher thinking category of world history would always say, individuals seeking their own self-interest and hedonism and self-pleasure never leads to the common good. And if that's the case, no one flourishes. And it's only when people self-sacrifice and come, and it goes back to the thing I was talking about, goodness and kindness. These are all things that are built into us when we thrive and we flourish. I flourish when you, and in fact, in reading about marriage over the years, one of the definitions I love about marriage is the husband and wife's relationship is they're there to make sure the other flourish. So the question is when you're feeling frustrated and you want to do something for yourself, is, does my actions contribute to the flourishing of my spouse? And obviously there's gray areas in there. But that notion, so for me, again, coming back to, I'm not trying to, and I don't know if self-preservation, I'm just throwing it out there to be, provocative, and I'm always nuancing things.
Self-elevation or just selfish.
Self-interest is probably, self-focus. And I guess for me, being cast into the garden again is part of that. For me, in my thinking, that's part of the sinful result. Now you're going to work the ground. Before, you could just take the food. Now those plants are the food. Now you're going to have to work for it. You're going to sweat for it, and you're going to have to fight with the earth for it. Because I've cursed the earth now, that'll come up on it as well. So there's just a sense of, and so for me though, when the Spirit comes, there's a recovery of that. So how do we recover that? The only way we can live, I don't think we can be perfect. I think we're too fallen in that. For me, ultimately, the ultimate expression of the rejection of sinfulness is to live in a self-denying, self-giving place every day of our lives. Mm-hmm. So you see all the things coming together in my thinking.
If we look at Jesus as living that way, he would go off at times to restore himself. He would go up to the mountain. He would go off to pray. Yeah. He would,
because he was in the broken physical body that needed that.
Even Gethsemane.
Yeah.
Right.
The fear. And that shows you the psychology of the human brain, that part of him, that there was, even though he knew, well, maybe he didn't know the ultimate end or how it was going to pan out on the other side, because there was a self-limiting there. It doesn't mean that Jesus did not have perfect omniscience. He didn't know exactly what was going to happen. If he did, then that's because if he did, then that whole narrative in the garden is a farce.
Well, he had some sense, though. Take this cup from me.
Well, sense, he knew he was going to die. I think that was clear. He communicated that, but also, you're still living a human body. You get a paper cut. I don't think they had paper cuts back then. Papers cut. Papyrus cut. Oh man, that papyrus is so dry. But that hurts. He had to be thinking, I don't want to go through physical, even if you knew that you had to go through pain, and on the end of it, it'd be okay. I think what they're demonstrating is the genuine humanity that he existed in. So I guess as we close this series, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been interesting.
Very challenging and thought-provoking.
Yeah, very much.
It's not something we think about much.
A lot of conversations.
It's been,
it's kind of like we keep coming back to the legalism as you trace you know, from the Old Testament into church history and everything. Why are we so driven to being tied to the legalistic?
Because we want a clear way, we want to, because the Spirit calls us to give everything. And so, you know, going back to the early church, giving all year to the church, what's like, well, how much can I give to the church that's not going to affect me? How much can I give to the church that I'm not going to really feel it at the end of the year? Or how much can I give to the church so that if it's not 10%, as if it's this percentage, if it's okay. And if I give it, what are they going to do with it? Like, you know, like honestly, this is why I don't know who gives what. I don't, you know, Ken every now and then brings something out. I'm like, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to know who gives what because I don't really care. Because in the end, that's between individuals and God. But at the same time, that sense of giving oneself, is kind of like we wake up in the morning. It's kind of, you know, it's a perfect metaphor, and this maybe to end on as we close out our summer, and you all are both summer, you know, you're summer folks, you're going back. Sorry, Dave, you're not here with us, but you're a different category too. But as you go back, the notion of, like, my hope has always been to live a life or live in a community, a Christian community type sense, that we walk into this summer, we come up to Lake City, and the Spirit shifts into, it's like camp mode. Everything about myself while I'm here is, how can I serve? And that's impossible to sustain. And I'm a self, you know, like I'm you know, if the Fruit of the Spirit series did anything, it made me feel pretty crappy about myself. Which, you know, good, you know, but it's good to reflect on those things. But my point in that is that if we, to sum the whole thing up, is I would love this space, I would love our community, I would love us to live lives and to experiment with that sense of life together, where we are in that constant giving, where that defines who we are. Because I really kind of think if we did, that we would see genuine transformation through the whole community. I like if people were like, I don't know what's going on at that church over there, but those people are actually living out their faith.
I hope they do see that already.
I wish we were doing that in the world, in the church as a whole. But I mean, and here's the thing: this is why I don't believe in mega churches, because it happened. I think 150 person church is really about the size you need to take care of one another and to serve your community well.
Yeah.
Beyond that, you don't have the relationships, you don't have the
Well,
accountability.
you need to be able to know each other, and so you can perceive needs
Yeah.
and serve one another. You know?
And if we all have the idea that this is not our world, and actually we're living into that, then there would be no shame in saying I'm hurting or I'm struggling or I need
Exactly.
something. We'd be like, well, Lord, we have more. Let us, you know. But we live these privatized lives, and again, I think the privatized nature of how we live our lives is sin. But again, going back to, and Jim, because you want a sin that says I can be forgiven from, and I'm saying, like the reformers, he's like, oh, that's not sin. Everything about you is sin, and everything about you has been forgiven, and everything about you receives God's grace.
And I believe that.
Yeah.
And that's why in my mind, I keep coming back to that. So the simplicity of, we're not living up to our potential. We're not living the way God would want. We're disappointing Him. He knows that He created us. He knows we're capable of better, and we fall short.
And I think that if we actually lived that way, if we sought out to foster the fruit of the Spirit in our lives every day, and you had that in a concentration of, you know, as an individual, you do it and you feel like you're the Lone Ranger, and there's trash all over the world. How do I pick it all up? How do I self-give all the time? But when you're in a community where you constantly are being encouraged by that and seeing the benefits and feeling that, I mean, this is what generates the Hiker Center.
Yeah.
People feel it.
Well, that's
So-
what you hear testimony after testimony of people that go to the mission field, and they go and they say that I was changed from forever.
Yeah. Context changer.
Yeah, I went to serve, and I had hardly anything to use. All I could do was hold a starving child in my lap, or you know, it just changes you.
It decenters you. I think it's the realization that the world, the myopic world we live in, is really not about us. So it's sin. It's not what you think it is.
Thank you.
I'll stop the recording there, so.